My name was Avery Anderson, and the night my brother called me a nobody in a room full of uniforms, he had already sold the one place where my real life was documented. I had rehearsed other openings for this memory, cleaner ones that made me appear less complicit in my own erasure, but none of them held the truth as precisely as that sentence. The wound was not only that he lied, the wound was that he knew exactly which room to lie in. He chose polished brass, regimental flags, donor plaques, and the soft percussion of crystal against crystal, because hierarchy is easier to enforce when it already lives in the architecture. I arrived at the Military Foundation Gala with my invitation folded once inside my clutch, my name printed correctly, my rank history omitted, as if a mission were a clerical accident instead of a family habit. On paper, I was a guest. In choreography, I was overflow. The hall had the formal coldness of base ceremony spaces that had seen every season of public gratitude. Fluorescent spill washed over polished rails. Navy and gold bunting absorbed sound and returned it thinner. Servers moved through the aisles with the disciplined silence of people trained never to collide with status. At the centre sat the family dais, close enough to the podium that every camera could catch faces during speeches. At the perimeter, near the service corridor where swinging doors released brief breaths of steam and metal, I found my place card. Someone had angled it slightly away from the table line, as if even cardstock could be instructed not to intrude. Caleb stood 3 tables over, hand on the shoulder of a retired colonel, smiling with the confidence of a man who had never paid a price for turning narrative into property. He saw me. He registered me. Then he resumed his introduction and did not say my name. That pattern had started long before that night, and it had always been deniable to everyone who benefited from deniability. Caleb never shouted in private, never struck a table, never gave the room a scene it could condemn. He preferred social instruments that left no bruise. I forgot to add you to the speaking order. The photographer needed immediate family. We assumed you'd be more comfortable off stage. If I objected, I became difficult. If I stayed quiet, I became proof that no harm had occurred. Years earlier, when I first deployed in a logistics advisory capacity that involved contested routes and asset recovery under security risk, he called it admin travel in front of our relatives and watched who laughed. He tested language the way other people tested locks. He learned quickly that a woman who did not advertise her record could be stripped of it in public by anyone fluent in tone. By the spring before that gala, he had appointed himself family spokesman without a vote, then family strategist without a mandate, and then family steward without disclosure. He wore those roles like inherited rank. Our mother let him because conflict exhausted her. Our uncles let him because he spoke in bullet points, and men in suits often mistake organisation for integrity. I let him for too long because I kept believing substance would eventually outrun performance. Silence wasn't peace. It was surrender. I didn't yet say that line aloud that night, but I had begun to feel its weight in my chest like an issued plate, fitted late and worn anyway. I had returned from overseas, 36 hours earlier, still calibrating to domestic quiet, still waking to phantom transport manifests in my sleep, and I entered that hall with the disciplined fatigue of someone who could read danger in paperwork faster than in faces. When Caleb lifted his glass for the welcome toast, people turned because he had trained them to. The MC ceded him a minute she had not planned to cede. Donors smiled in anticipation of a polished anecdote. Uniformed guests angled their chairs to signal respect. He opened with gratitude, then with tribute, then with the family line he used whenever he wanted to fix me in place. "We honour service tonight," he said, gaze sweeping the room with practiced benevolence. "Real service, verified service, the kind that survives public review." A few heads nodded. He let the phrase settle. Then he looked directly at me and delivered the sentence he had prepared for days. "Sit down, Avery. This table is for people with verifiable service, not storage unit myths." Laughter came in fragments, uneven but sufficient. Some faces tightened and looked away. Most did what crowds do when status has already chosen a side. They watched me. I did not stand. I did not defend myself in a voice built for transport briefings and sworn statements. I placed my water glass on its coaster so it would not ring against the table, and I answered exactly once. Noted. The word landed softly, almost administrative, and that was the point. I had learned that outrage in those rooms became evidence against the person already marked as peripheral. Composure, by contrast, could become record. Caleb gave me the small, victorious smile he reserved for contained opponents, then pivoted back to the room with a joke about family legends and misplaced receipts. Someone at the dais repeated the phrase "storage unit myths" with amusement, and 3 phones rose discreetly to capture reaction shots. I tracked the details the way I tracked cargo chain incidents: who repeated the line, who refused, who met my eyes, and who studied their napkin fold as if linen offered moral shelter. No one objected. Not him, not the board members, not the retired officers who had thanked me by email in other years for troubleshooting their veterans' logistics grants when no one else could untangle them. The central offence had happened before the toast, before the place card, before I crossed the threshold of that hall. While I was deployed, Caleb had filed abandonment paperwork on my storage unit and signed my name where mine was required. He did not break in with bolt cutters or hire men in masks. He used office hours, not darkness. He submitted forms that represented me as unreachable and uninterested, cited arrears that did not exist, and accelerated a liquidation process through a facility manager who knew him from foundation events and trusted his certainty more than my absent record. The unit went to auction under a legal shell that looked tidy from outside. He believed it held boxes of old notebooks, a few uniforms, maybe sentimental clutter he could mock at future dinners. He had no idea that its inventoried contents included chain of custody files from joint operations, patent originals I had not yet assigned, trust instruments tied to family inheritance contingencies, and military authenticated archives with signatures that determined ownership, liability, and reputation across institutions that did not care about sibling rivalry, but cared deeply about records. I had spent years building my life in ledgers, because ledgers do not forget when rooms do. Every sensitive item I stored had pre-deployment documentation, witness initials, serial references, and redundant custody notes kept through approved channels. I did that because competence in my field requires paranoia that can be audited. Caleb interpreted that discipline as secrecy, and secrecy as weakness, and weakness as available territory. Standing in that brass hall, hearing him reduce a secured archive to a punchline, I felt something inside me crack in a way I could not tape back together with courtesy. Not because the insult was novel, but because the insult had reached the exact evidence he had already tried to erase. He had crossed from contempt into conversion. He had transformed family theatre into legal exposure and expected applause to shield him from consequence. Halfway through dinner, a retired logistics captain approached my table under the pretext of complimenting the catering and slid a folded cocktail napkin beside my plate without looking down. Her movement was clean, unhurried, familiar to anyone who had ever handed off sensitive notes in public spaces where privacy was decorative. "You may want this before he speaks to the trustees tomorrow," she said, then returned to her seat. Inside the napkin was a copied agenda for a closed-door foundation briefing in Caleb's name, Asset Stewardship Consolidation, with bullet points on family holdings, disposal authority, and beneficiary communication strategy. My exclusion was explicit. My signature was listed under Historical Records Unavailable. I read it once, then again, and placed the paper in my clutch beside my invitation. External contact, loaded setup, physical evidence. All 3 entered the same hour, and I recognized the shape of what was forming. He was not improvising humiliation, he was institutionalizing it. By the second week after my return, I had already initiated retrieval protocols and legal preservation notices, but that night at the gala was where the wound became language I could no longer dilute for anyone's comfort. Caleb ended his toast to applause and sat at the centre table as if centrality were merit. I remained near the service corridor where the doors kept opening and closing behind me, releasing brief gusts of heat, dishwater, and steel. In that alternating air, I understood with painful clarity that my family had mistaken my restraint for surrender because surrender is what made their arrangement convenient. They were wrong. I was quiet because I was counting. I was still because I was timing. My name is Avery Anderson, and I didn't need that room to believe me. I needed it to witness what record-keeping does to men who sell what they never bothered to understand. The applause had not fully faded when the MC announced a brief stewardship briefing for trustees and major donors in the adjoining conference suite, and I watched Caleb rise as if the program had been built around his posture from the beginning. Chairs scraped against waxed floors, uniforms and tailored jackets shifted toward the glass doors at the north end of the hall, and a staff captain began checking name badges with the polite severity people use when exclusion must look procedural. I stayed seated for one breath, then stood with the others, invitation in hand, because my name had appeared on the gala credential list, and I intended to test every boundary in plain view. The service corridor behind me exhaled another draft of steam and detergent. Ahead, the conference suite gleamed with brushed steel trim, and the sterile blue of wall-mounted displays already loaded with Caleb's title slide, Anderson Family Asset Continuity Initiative. He had moved from Toastmaster to operator in under 10 minutes. The room followed. At the threshold, the staff captain looked at my badge and hesitated. That hesitation carried the entire family history in miniature. Recognition, uncertainty, retreat to hierarchy. "Ma'am, this session is restricted," he said, voice low enough to imply embarrassment, loud enough for 3 nearby guests to hear. Caleb turned from the front table before I answered. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. "Captain, it is fine," he said. "Avery can stay for the overview if she is quiet." He let the sentence breathe, then added the blade. "When we move to operational details, real operators only." There was a small stir, the social rustle of people deciding whether to laugh. A board member near the back pressed her lips together and stared at the agenda packet. 2 donors smiled with practiced neutrality. One retired brigadier gave a short, approving nod, as if credential policing were a form of governance virtue. Caleb had given them permission to treat me as tolerated background, and the room accepted the permission because it cost them nothing. I walked in without comment and took a seat at the side wall, one chair behind the last row, where the screen reflected in the glass and doubled his name over the dark outside courtyard. On the central table lay printed binders with tabbed sections. Holdings, custodial authority, legacy communications. None had been set at my place because no place had been set for me. A junior coordinator offered water to every seat in the main rows and stepped around me with professional invisibility so polished it almost qualified as choreography. Caleb began with market language, then donor language, then family language, converting bloodlines into line items with the confidence of a man who had never been forced to annotate his own claims. "Continuity depends on decisiveness," he said, tapping the laser pointer against a bullet list. "Fragmented narratives create legal drag. Unified stewardship protects value." I could feel the cocktail napkin agenda in my clutch like a second pulse. Historical records unavailable, disposal authority consolidated, beneficiary notification discretionary. He had moved my erasure from dinner banter into institutional draft text, and that shift mattered more than the insult because documents outlive apologies. Halfway through the deck, he clicked to a slide titled Verification Standards. The first bullet read, "Documentary proof required." The second read, "Claims without chain of custody deemed anecdotal." Then he looked toward me with that same measured benevolence he had used at the toast. "Our family has heard many stories over the years," he said. "Travel stories, service-adjacent stories, storage stories. Going forward, only verifiable submissions enter the record." A murmur passed through the table. Someone at the far end said, "Prudent." Another said, "Long overdue." No one asked who had defined verifiable, who had been denied access to records, who had sold which archives while I was overseas. Caleb clicked again and brought up a draft resolution with his name listed under interim sole steward pending formal ratification. At the bottom, in smaller text, appeared my full name beside a parenthetical note, status unresolved. I stood then, not abruptly, just enough to ask for the microphone nearest the wall. The coordinator froze, waiting for Caleb's signal. He gave a soft shake of his head and answered for me. "Not tonight, Avery. This segment is for presenters." I held his gaze. "I am a named party in your resolution." He smiled without warmth. "You are a referenced party." The distinction drew a few strained chuckles, and the humiliation achieved what he intended. Not open hostility, but administrative diminishment, the kind that can be replayed later as ordinary meeting control. The retired brigadier finally looked at me directly, perhaps expecting an outburst that would justify removing me. I gave him none. I sat down, folded my hands over my clutch, and listened while Caleb invited questions from participants with active custodial function. When one donor asked whether any sibling objections should delay ratification, Caleb answered before anyone else could breathe. No material objections, no admissible record conflict. I wrote the phrase verbatim on the back of the agenda copy. The pen tip pressed hard enough to leave an impression through 2 layers of paper. By the time the session adjourned, the brass hall had thinned to staff, floral contractors, and 2 officers reviewing transport details near the loading bay. It was nearly 2300, and the base had entered that late-hour quiet where every footstep sounds overcommitted. Caleb gathered his binders into a leather case while trustees formed a half-circle around him, asking about signatures, deadlines, and press language. I approached once the circle opened, maintaining the same distance I would use in a formal debrief. "Provide me the full draft and supporting exhibits by 0900, I said. "You included me in the resolution. Discovery begins now." He adjusted his cuff, eyes on the case latch. "You keep confusing access with entitlement." "I keep distinguishing process from performance." That landed closer than he expected. His jaw tightened for a second. Then he reset his expression and delivered the line for his remaining audience. "Avery, you were always better at filing than leading. Do not mistake clerical habits for command authority." The nearest trustee looked down. Another pretended to answer a message that had not arrived. Caleb gave them his profile, not his full face, the angle he used when he wanted to appear burdened rather than cruel. "Go home," he said quietly. "This is above your operational tier." He walked past me toward the private elevator reserved for board officers. No one stopped him. No one addressed me. The sweet lights dimmed in programmed stages, leaving reflections on the glass and a faint smell of stale coffee, toner heat, and polished wood. I remained by the side table until the last non-essential guest left, then opened my clutch and laid out, in order, the invitation, the copied agenda, my handwritten notes, and a business card from the staff captain whose checkpoint had been used to stage the first exclusion. I photographed each item with timestamp and geolocation enabled, uploaded the images to my secure archive, and generated a preservation hash on my phone before the building's network cycle reset at midnight. Documentation first, reaction second. In my field, that sequence had kept shipments, lives, and reputations from vanishing into someone else's narrative. Outside, the night air carried diesel from the motor pool and the mineral scent of wet concrete. A line of flags along the courtyard edge snapped once in the wind, then settled. I stood under the portico light, phone in hand, and called Mara Voss, the civilian attorney who handled asset recovery matters for deployed personnel. She answered on the 3rd ring with the clipped alertness of someone who had learned that late calls are rarely social. "Tell me you are safe," she said. "I am safe," I replied. "I need emergency filings by morning. Fraud, conversion, and injunctive relief tied to estate instruments and military-authenticated archives." She was silent for 2 beats, then, "Do you have documentary support tonight, not tomorrow?" "Yes. Public statements, exclusion records, draft consolidation agenda, named party status, and prior notice defects. More to follow. Preserve everything. Send encrypted copies now. I will draft a demand letter and a temporary restraining packet before dawn." I ended the call and sent the files from the curb, watching each progress bar complete under the white pool of the portico fixture. My hands were steady. The steadiness did not mean I felt nothing. It meant feeling had been sorted into channels that could survive scrutiny. Anger belonged in private breath, not public record. Public record required sequence, statutes, signatures, and witnesses who could not be dismissed as sentimental. A black sedan rolled up from the lower lot, and my mother stepped out, shawl gathered tight against the wind. She had left the conference suite early and found me only now, after the hierarchy had finished speaking. Her face looked smaller in that light, the fatigue lines around her mouth deeper than I remembered before deployment. "You should not push him in front of donors," she said without greeting. "He is carrying a great deal." I looked at her for a long moment. "He sold my unit while I was overseas." She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with practiced sorrow. "He said there were overdue fees and abandoned property notices. He forged my signature." Her fingers tightened on the shawl fringe. "If this becomes public, it will damage all of us." There it was, the family doctrine in one sentence. Harm was negotiable, exposure was not. I could have given her the full inventory list, the chain of custody logs, the trust instruments Caleb had tried to root around. I could have named every statute he had triggered by treating records as props. Instead, I answered with the only boundary that mattered at that hour. It is already public. He made it public when he put my name on his slide. She studied me as if searching for the daughter who would retreat to keep the room comfortable. She did not find her. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Nothing tonight," I said. "Read what your son filed, then decide whether you want truth or convenience, and call me when you can tell the difference." She drew back as though I had spoken too sharply, though my tone had remained level. We stood in shared silence while a forklift beeped in reverse at the loading bay, and a pair of junior officers crossed the courtyard without seeing us. I did not move to soften the moment. Restraint is often mistaken for permission. That night, I let it become perimeter. When she left, I walked to my car, placed the clutch on the passenger seat, and sat with both hands on the wheel until the dashboard clock turned to 23:17. Then I opened a fresh note and wrote a single line for the morning filing. Public humiliation is not the claim. Fraud is the claim. Conversion is the claim. I read it once, locked the note, and started the engine. I didn't need to win that room in one night. I needed the record to hold when the room changed sides. I eased out of the base lot and kept my speed at the posted limit even after the gate fell behind me, because discipline had always been my first language and I trusted it more than fury. The road along the perimeter fence was slick from a late mist, sodium lights reflecting in broken gold across the hood, and each intersection gave me one more clean second to sort the night into categories: statement, witness, document, remedy. My phone vibrated twice in the console. I did not touch it until I reached the first long light beyond the checkpoint. The family thread had already populated itself. Caleb had posted a photo from the conference suite, one hand on the laser pointer, captioned, "Stewardship requires clarity." Two uncles had replied with applause icons. My mother had typed, "Proud of your leadership, son," then deleted and reposted it with a comma moved, as if punctuation could make allegiance look less deliberate. I set the phone face down and let the light turn green without urgency. In our family, invalidation had never arrived as one dramatic event. It arrived as protocol. Caleb spoke first, therefore he became the source. Caleb interpreted silence, therefore silence became confession. Caleb curated photographs, therefore memory acquired a crop line. The night air through the cracked window carried rain, asphalt, and the thin metallic scent that settles near freight routes, and that scent pulled me backward to one of the earliest nights I understood what he was building. I was 19, home on leave between training blocks, standing in my grandmother's dining room while relatives arranged place cards for her 70th. Caleb moved mine from the head table to a side console near the kitchen pass-through and said, with a smile everyone accepted, "You prefer practical stations." When I asked why my name was missing from the program, he answered, "You had no speaking role." My grandmother looked at me once, then at him, and chose the easier face. That pattern persisted because it worked. 3 years later, after my first overseas advisory tour, the County Veterans Council asked for short deployment remarks at a scholarship luncheon. I arrived in service dress with prepared notes and found my name absent from the EMC packet. Caleb had chaired logistics for the event, and he stood beside the podium, introducing a local sponsor's son who had completed a weekend leadership retreat. "We are honouring direct contributors," he said into the microphone. Then, in an aside he knew I could hear, "Not support travellers." The table near me laughed softly, the polite laugh of people who assumed they were hearing insider truth. I sat through the luncheon, clapped for every recipient, and drove back to base with my speech still folded in my coat pocket. By the time I reached the gate, the fold had cut a white line through the paper where his sentence kept replaying. By the second year of my advisory assignment, the insults had grown more technical because technical language confers legitimacy on cruelty. At a family trust review, Caleb brought in an outside accountant and introduced me as non-financial next of kin. Though I held the only operational portfolio with authenticated inventories attached to contingent assets, he projected a chart with roles and placed me under historical liaison, a label invented to sound ceremonial and harmless. I asked for correction in writing. He replied, "We can revisit once your contributions are independently verifiable." It was the same blade in a different sheath. Invalidation was never spontaneous with him. It was drafted, circulated, and delivered with meeting minutes. I turned onto my street just after midnight, headlights sweeping over rowhouse brick, wet shrubs, and recycling bins, lined like quiet sentries at the curb. My home looked unchanged, which was the cruelest contrast to nights like that one. Inside, I locked the deadbolt, set my clutch on the kitchen island, and switched on only the under-cabinet lights, leaving the rest of the house in shadow so my focus would narrow. My phone lit again. This time it was a voicemail from trustee Harlan Pike, one of Caleb's most dependable nodders in public rooms. I played it on speaker while I removed my shoes and lined them beside the door. Avery, this is Harlan. I wanted to encourage calm. You appeared understandably emotional this evening. Caleb's intent is continuity, not exclusion. If you have sentimental concerns about old storage materials, perhaps submit them through his office before legal escalation. It would be better for everyone. He ended with a long inhale and no goodbye. I stood still long enough to hear the refrigerator cycle on. Sentimental concerns. His message was not an outlier. It was textbook atmosphere, the soft administrative voice that recast theft as misunderstanding and hierarchy as stewardship. I saved the voicemail to evidence storage, tagged it with time and origin, and sent a copy to Mara with one line, additional witness language minimizing claim scope. The kitchen clock clicked to 0011. I opened the hall closet, moved the vacuum canister aside, and pulled out the narrow black case from the top shelf, the one with no external label and 2 tamper strips crossing the latch. Caleb had once found that case at a holiday gathering when he was searching for spare chairs and held it up like a stage prop. "What is this, Avery? Secret medals?" he asked, turning it in his hands while cousins watched from the den. "Or more storage mythology?" I took it from him without comment and said it contained professional archives. He laughed and told the room, "Translation, old receipts." That laugh had lived rent-free in too many rooms for too many years. I peeled the tamper strips now and set them on wax paper for retention, then opened the case. The challenge coins sat in a recessed foam cutout, heavy, matte, and almost black except where the edges caught light. One side bore my call sign in small capitals and the insignia of the logistics command cell I had advised. The other carried an engraved serial ring around a centered compass rose, AO-17-4421, a countable officer series with a tiny recessed node that read as decorative unless you knew where to look. Most people treated challenge coins as ceremony objects, traded at bars or mounted in shadow boxes. This one was an access key. Trent had commissioned a limited run for personnel handling high-risk inventory transfers, each chip paired to a sealed ledger partition and 2-factor verification. If the paper trail was attacked, the metadata still stood. If the unit was emptied, custody could still be proven. I ran my thumb across the engraved ridge and remembered the day he issued it. We had been in a fluorescent briefing room with bad coffee and a wall map full of freight corridors marked in grease pencil. Chief Warrant Officer Elias Trent slid the coin across the table and said, "You are responsible for records no one values until a court asks for them. Keep this off lanyards and off ego displays. This is not a token. This is a key." I had nodded, signed the receipt log, and stored the coin exactly as instructed because he was the first senior officer who spoke to me as if precision were character, not personality. At 0:19, I carried the case to my office, woke the secure laptop, and launched the ledger client from an encrypted partition. The screen requested physical key authentication. I touched the coin to the NFC reader taped beneath the desk lip, held it steady until the soft confirmation tone sounded, then entered my passphrase and rotating numeric seed. A grey progress bar moved across black, unadorned, and unsentimental. Access granted. Partition, Anderson_AO17. Chain integrity valid. Last notarized snapshot 10 days pre-deployment. The first document opened into a paneled ledger with hash values at the top, item lines below, and attached image thumbnails for each inventory entry. I scrolled slowly, forcing my breathing to remain even. Patent originals catalogued by filing draft number and page count. Trust instruments, each tagged with witness signature IDs and vault transfer references. Operational archives with redacted mission labels but full custody sequences, including serial numbers for drives, seal IDs, and handoff times. There it was, the architecture Caleb had dismissed as myth. Immutable timestamps, dual signatures, geolocated intake photos, notarized checksum records, and a cross-certified manifest export already recognized by department systems. I generated a fresh hash and compared it to the prior notarized hash. Match. My inbox pinged with Mara's secure reply as I exported the first evidentiary packet. Received. Excellent foundation. Need corroborating witness for pre-deployment seal and storage intake. Can you tie ledger to accountable officer registry without discretionary testimony from family? I answered immediately. Yes. Registry tie via Department Property Accountability Records. Witness available through base office. Requesting subpoena path at 0700. She replied 30 seconds later. Do not wait for 700. I am drafting emergency filings now. Send coin authentication screenshots and full chain table. I sent what she requested, then opened the image archive attached to item cluster 4C, the cluster I had feared most after learning of the auction. The photographs loaded one by one, archival boxes on steel shelving, tamper tape intact, barcodes readable, my initials and Trent's on the custody form positioned in frame. The date stamp sat in the corner like a small, unimpressed witness. I remembered that intake day with painful clarity because Caleb had called while I was still at the facility and asked whether I could finally clear out the old unit clutter before the Family Foundation calendar launch. I told him the unit contained restricted documents and legal originals. He answered, then it contains excuses. That had been 6 months before he forged abandonment notices. In his mind, words erased records. In mine, records survived words. At 0:43, I printed the condensed manifest to the secure tray and listened to each page land with mechanical certainty. The sound steadied me. I assembled a binder with tab separators, proof of ownership, proof of custody, proof of unlawful transfer, proof of reputational harm. Under reputational harm, I inserted screenshots from the gala and the conference slide where he labelled my status unresolved while claiming no admissible conflict. For years, he had relied on the gap between what rooms assumed and what files contained. Tonight, I began closing that gap with staples, timestamps, and signatures that did not ask permission. Another message appeared, this one from an unknown number with a local area code. The text read, I was at the briefing. He told us no record existed. If you file, ask for backup camera from Suite Corridor 2241 to 2258. It shows him instructing staff on seating and access. No name, no signature. I took a screenshot, captured metadata, and forwarded it to Mara with the notation anonymous tip, potentially corroborative, authentication pending. Then I archived the original and placed the phone in airplane mode for 10 minutes while I finished indexing documents. External contacts were useful only if handled with chain discipline. At 1:07, I stood to stretch and caught my reflection in the dark window. Blouse wrinkled from the gala, hair coming loose at the nape, face older than the one in my passport by a full campaign of disappointments. I did not look defeated. I looked exact. The realization arrived without drama and settled where panic had been earlier. Caleb had taught rooms to read me as peripheral because peripheral people do not threaten central narratives. He had mistaken economy of speech for absence of capacity. He had mistaken my restraint for retreat. All those years of being cut out of photos, programs, speaking lists, and stewardship drafts had trained me for this hour more effectively than praise ever could have. I returned to the desk and opened a final file, personal statement for emergency hearing. I wrote in plain language, no ornaments, no private grief converted into spectacle. I described the overseas deployment dates, the storage status, the forged notice defect, the sale chain, and the legal significance of the inventoried contents. Then I added one paragraph Caleb would hate because it refused the role he had assigned me. I am not contesting a family disagreement. I am reporting documentary fraud, unlawful conversion, and interference with controlled records. I am prepared to testify and submit verified archives. When I finished, I saved the statement, encrypted the drive clone, and placed the challenge coin back into its foam cradle only after photographing it beside the authentication screen and that night's newspaper for temporal verification. By 1:36, the first evidentiary package had reached Mara's filing portal, complete enough for immediate injunction request and strong enough to survive the first wave of dismissive language. I closed the laptop, turned off the office light, and carried the binder to the front hall table where I would not forget it at dawn. The house was quiet except for rain beginning again on the windows, steady and unadorned. Caleb had spent years making me smaller in rooms designed for applause. He had never understood what I was building in files designed for court. At 1:41, with rain counting a steady rhythm against the glass, I took my phone off airplane mode and watched the queue of messages repopulate with the speed of a system that had been waiting to overtake me. Mara's first update was procedural and sharp. Have filing packet drafted, injunction language tightened, clerk contact alerted for emergency intake at opening. The second came 30 seconds later with one line that changed the shape of my morning. Caleb's counsel has requested a pre-hearing family alignment session at 800 in the Foundation's downtown conference center. Attendance list excludes you. I stared at that sentence until the room around me settled into hard edges. He was trying to manufacture consensus before a judge could establish fact. Exclusion first, ratification second, and then the familiar performance that any objection arrived too late to matter. I called Mara immediately. She answered without greeting, keyboard noise in the background, papers shifting in quick stacks. "Do not attend alone," she said. "If they block access, we document the block and convert it into intent." "I can be there by 0750, I said. "Send me the notice and metadata. It is already in your secure folder. Also, your anonymous tip about corridor camera 2241 to 2258 checked out enough for preservation demand. I filed the hold request to base security and copied opposing counsel so they cannot claim surprise later." That result landed like clean oxygen. "Any response?" "Automated acknowledgement only. Human reply pending. Expect delay tactics." Delay tactics had always been Caleb's preferred terrain, because delay lets power reframe theft as fatigue. I opened the notice she had sent. The letterhead carried the Foundation crest in embossed navy. Subject line, Stewardship Clarification Meeting. Body text, essential stakeholders only. Non-essential observers deferred pending verification review. My name did not appear in any form, not even under deferred parties. He had moved past insulting me in rooms and into drafting me out of process entirely. I exported the file, captured headers, and added it to the binder under pre-litigation conduct. At 2:03, I sent one more message, this time to Chief Warrant Officer Elias Trent, through his official channel and his private emergency alias, because he had taught me redundancy years earlier and he had never once mistaken formality for distance when records were at risk. Request: Urgent Accountable Officer Registry Certification and Pre-Deployment Seal Attestation for Anderson AO-17 Inventory Partition. Emergency hearing likely today. I didn't ask for sympathy, I asked for verification, then I shut the office down in reverse order, checked every lock and lay on the couch fully dressed with the binder on the floor beside me. Sleep came in thin segments, 20 minutes at a time, each one ending with the sensation that I had forgotten a signature line. By 6:40, rain had thinned to a cold mist that turned the sidewalks silver. I wore a dark suit I usually reserved for incident reviews and carried 2 binders, one for the court, one for anything the morning tried to take from me before court. The Foundation's downtown conference center occupied the top 2 floors of a glass and limestone building that smelled of lemon polish, toner heat, and expensive restraint. The lobby guard scanned badges at a waist-high gate where people with donor pins crossed without pausing. When I presented my ID, he checked his tablet, frowned, and tried again. "Ms. Anderson, I do not have you on today's access roster. I'm a named party in the underlying asset dispute," I said. "Who submitted the roster?" "Foundation Counsel's office. Please print or email the denial and the listed attendees." He hesitated, then nodded toward a side desk. "I can issue an incident slip. I cannot override the list." Incident slip is sufficient. By 7:54, I stood beside a potted ficus under recessed lights while the side desk printer delivered a single-page exclusion record with timestamp, guard ID, and the phrase access denied per client instruction. Through the glass wall to the private elevator bank, I watched Caleb arrive with 2 board members, Trustee Harlan Pike, and a man in charcoal who carried a legal folio and introduced himself to staff by first name only. Caleb saw me, registered the paper in my hand, and turned to Pike with a smile shaped for an audience. "We begin on time," he said, voice pitched to carry. "Real operators are already upstairs." Pike gave the small laugh he used when he wanted to signal allegiance without owning the words. "No observers then." Caleb answered. No theatrics. He did not approach me, he did not need to. The slight was complete in logistics, not language. Elevator priority granted, access denied logged, narrative seeded for every person who watched them pass. I sent the exclusion slip to Mara with a photo of the elevator directory and the time visible on my lock screen. She replied in less than a minute. Perfect. Leave now. We file with this attached. I turned toward the street, and the doorman opened the door with the careful courtesy people use when they know they are ushering someone out of a room she had every right to enter. Outside, a delivery truck hissed at the curb. I stood under the awning long enough to call the county clerk's emergency civil intake line and confirm docket availability. The clerk on duty sounded overworked and sceptical in equal measure. Replevin requests are not theatre tickets, she said. If this is a family storage disagreement, file standard and wait. It is a conversion and fraud action involving controlled records and forged abandonment notices, I answered. Council is transmitting verified exhibits now. A pause. Keyboard clicks. Bring originals and certified identity. I am en route. By 9:10, in the county civil annex, I sat in a narrow waiting area beneath fluorescent fixtures that flattened everyone into the same tired shade. A wall clock clicked louder than it should have. Two men from a regional logistics contractor occupied the chairs across from me, suits slightly too bright for court and conversations slightly too loud for discretion. One glanced at my binder tabs and said to the other, not quietly, "This will settle once someone explains salvage law to her." The other replied, "Storage auctions are final unless you can prove a military chain break, and that almost never happens." He gave me a brief nod that was not respect and not apology. "No offence," I met his eyes. "None taken." At intake window 3, the clerk reviewed our filing packet, then tapped the page where my declaration identified trust instruments and operational archives. If these are personal keepsakes, the court may not prioritise emergency relief. Mara beside me kept her tone level. They are not keepsakes. Exhibit D includes notarized inventory and authenticated custody references. The clerk scanned the first page, then the second, and her posture changed by small degrees. "I still need registry confirmation tying you to accountable officer status," she said, looking at me now, not past me. "Without that, opposing counsel will frame this as sentimental attachment." "I requested that certification at 0203, I said. "It is pending." Mara leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Opposing counsel will attempt to run a parallel ratification narrative by noon. We need a hearing slot before they anchor the room." The clerk considered us, then stamped the packet with provisional intake status and slid a receipt under the glass. "Courtroom 4B preliminary conference at 11:30 if the judge accepts emergency posture. If your certification arrives, upload and hand carry." As we stepped back, my phone vibrated with a restricted number call. I answered in the corridor where the paint smelled fresh over old plaster, and the vending machine hummed behind me. A base security administrator introduced herself and spoke in the clipped cadence of someone reading from a memo she did not draft. "Regarding your preservation request for corridor footage, release is denied pending Foundation Board consent." "Board consent?" I said. "The footage pertains to a legal hold request connected to active fraud allegations." "Sir, ma'am, our guidance says board-controlled event assets require board approval for external dissemination. Then preserve the footage and send me the retention confirmation in writing." Another pause, then softer. "Retention confirmed for 30 days. Written confirmation will follow. Send it to me and counsel within the hour. I will do what I can." The line ended. External contact outcome, partial and defensive, but on record. I logged the call immediately, then rejoined Mara near the stairwell where she was annotating our argument order in narrow, deliberate script. "They refused release," I said, "but confirmed retention for 30 days. "Good," she said. Refusal becomes discovery leverage. At 10:48, the annex corridor began to thicken with attorneys, couriers and parties, clutching folders like flotation devices. Caleb arrived at 11:02 with his counsel and two Foundation associates I recognized from donor events, one of them the retired brigadier who had watched my exclusion in silence the night before. Caleb's suit was immaculate, tie-centered, expression composed for institutional photography. He stopped 6 feet from us and addressed Mara as if I were an attachment. "Counselor, we remain open to private resolution if your client withdraws allegations that damage family and foundation alike." Mara did not move. "My client is present. You may address her directly." He turned his gaze to me with visible reluctance. "Avery, this escalation serves no one. You are misreading stewardship actions as personal attack." "You forged abandonment paperwork," I said. "You sold controlled inventory while I was deployed." His counsel stepped in with rehearsed patience. "Ms. Anderson, we dispute both characterization and intent. At most, this is a documentation misunderstanding." I held up the provisional intake receipt. "Then you can explain your misunderstanding to the judge." Caleb's jaw flexed once. "You are out of your depth in this venue." I answered with the same calm I had used at the gala. "I work in venues where records decide outcomes." Before he could respond, the courtroom door opened and a bailiff called preliminary parties for 4B to assemble by the side rail. We moved with the group into the antechamber, a smaller room panelled in scuffed oak with benches too close together and air that carried paper dust, wet wool, and old radiator heat. The social pressure tightened there because space removed all pretense of privacy. Every glance became public annotation. One of Caleb's associates leaned toward another and whispered, "She will not have officer certification in time." The retired brigadier looked at his watch and said nothing. At 11:22, while we waited for judicial entry, my phone flashed with a new secure message. Sender, E. Trent, CWO. Attachment, AO registry certification signed. Seal attestation signed. Hash verification summary. Beneath the attachments, a short line. Arrived in building. Bringing originals. I felt the shift physically, not as relief but as alignment, like a map grid finally locking to terrain. I forwarded the files to Mara, who scanned the first page and exhaled through her nose once, a rare gesture from her. "This changes the room," she said. The door at the rear opened again. Elias Trent entered in service uniform under a weather-darkened overcoat, carrying a rigid document case with tamper seals intact. He paused at the threshold to remove his gloves, then scanned the benches until his eyes found me. He did not perform surprise for the audience. He crossed the room at a measured pace and stopped one arm's length away. "Ms. Anderson," he said, formal and clear, "I received your request. Originals are here. Chain certifications are complete." Caleb's counsel rose halfway from his bench. "And you are?" Trent turned just enough to include the room. "Chief Warrant Officer Elias Trent, Base Property Accountability Office." He set the case on the side table, opened it, and placed the top certification where the caption was visible to counsel and clerk alike. "For clarity, Ms. Avery Anderson was the accountable officer of record for inventory partition AO-17-4421 prior to deployment. I supervised the sealed intake and verified the ledger hash this morning against department records." Silence moved across the benches in a slow, unmistakable wave. The retired brigadier straightened and looked at me as if seeing me for the first time in full scale. One of the contractor men from intake lowered his eyes to his shoes. Caleb tried to speak, stopped to swallow, then tried again. "With respect, Chief, this is a family property matter." Trent did not raise his voice. "No, sir, it is a records matter with legal consequences." The bailiff stepped in from the inner door and called us to standing positions for the judge. As we rose, Trent handed Mara the signed originals and gave me one brief nod that contained neither pity nor theatre, only recognition grounded in record. In that cramped antechamber with fluorescent light flattening everyone equally and the radiator ticking like a metronome for institutional time, the hierarchy Caleb had spent years rehearsing lost its centre. A credible witness had entered, and the room could no longer pretend not to understand who I was. The inner courtroom doors opened, and we filed in by rank of urgency rather than rank of title, each of us carrying paper that claimed to be more trustworthy than memory. Courtroom 4B held the same institutional austerity I had seen in transit hearings overseas. Varnished wood, dulled by years of elbows, fluorescent panels that left no flattering shadows, a state seal mounted above the bench as if authority needed metal reinforcement. The gallery was half full with waiting parties from other dockets. people who had come for landlord disputes and contract defaults, and now found themselves watching a family argument harden into a fraud record. The bailiff directed us to counsel tables. Caleb took the seat closest to the aisle, shoulders squared toward the bench, his attorney arranging exhibits with careful territorial movements. Mara set our binders in a clean line, tabs exposed, and slid one legal pad toward me without looking up. On the top margin she had written, in block letters, "Answer only what is asked. Preserve cadence." When the judge entered, everyone stood. Judge Lenora Vance was smaller than I expected and carried none of the theatrical impatience some judges cultivate for control. She scanned the room once, took her seat, and looked directly at the clerk. Emergency replevin and fraud conference. Anderson versus Anderson et al. Appearances. Counsel identified themselves. Mara's tone was clipped and exact. Opposing counsel, Mr. Danning, used 3 extra honorifics and an unnecessary preface about regrettable family strain. Judge Vance lifted one hand and ended his introduction mid-sentence. "I am not a mediator for hurt feelings, counsel. I am here for law and record. Proceed." That sentence altered the temperature more effectively than any raised voice could have. Mara stood first. She did not pace, did not perform, did not ask for sympathy. She gave the court a narrow frame and held it. "Your Honour, this is a conversion and fraudulent transfer matter involving inventoried property, controlled records and forged abandonment submissions while my client was deployed overseas in a documented advisory role. We seek immediate preservation, seizure where recoverable, and injunction against further disposal pending merits." Mr. Danning rose before she sat. "Your Honour, the respondent asks the court to note, this is, at root, a private storage dispute inflated by family tensions. The petitioner was not in active possession, failed to maintain direct oversight, and now attempts to recast an administrative auction as a criminal narrative." I watched Judge Vance's pen remain still through most of his statement and begin moving only when he said, "administrative auction." She looked up. "Counsel, if you intend to rely on abandonment process, you will establish notice compliance and authority chain, not adjectives." Mara turned one tab and handed up the first packet through the clerk. "Notice compliance is where respondent fails. Exhibit B shows signature mismatch and notice dispatch to a non-operational address despite active deployment contact on file. Exhibit D contains notarized inventory, serial references, and custody logs. Exhibit F, filed moments ago, provides accountable officer registry certification and seal attestation from Chief Warrant Officer Elias Trent, present in court with originals." A small rustle moved through the gallery. Caleb kept his eyes on the bench, but I saw the muscle in his jaw begin to pulse. Mr. Danning requested to voir dire the witness, voice still confident, though thinner now at the edges. Judge Vance nodded. "Call him." Trent stepped to the stand with the same controlled economy he brought to every chain of custody briefing I had ever attended. He took the oath, stated his office, and placed 2 sealed certifications before the clerk. Under questioning, he gave dates, intake procedure, ledger verification method, and department registry tie without embellishment. No speech, no posture, only process. Mara asked one final question. "Chief Warrant Officer Trent, in your professional capacity, who was the accountable officer of record for partition AO-17-4421 before deployment?" "Ms. Avery Anderson," he said. "I supervised the sealed intake." "And based on your review this morning, did the ledger integrity hold?" "Yes. Hash-matched departmental record, Mr." Danning stood for cross and attempted the familiar downgrade. "Chief Trent, challenge coins are often ceremonial, are they not? Symbolic rather than evidentiary." Trent looked at him once, then at the judge. "Some are ceremonial. This one is an encrypted access key tied to sealed ledger partitions. We issue them for accountability, not decoration." "Could a family member have misunderstood the contents of the unit?" "Misunderstanding does not produce forged signatures." No one in the room moved for a full second after he said it. The silence was not dramatic. It was administrative, the sound of a narrative losing admissibility. Judge Vance asked for the coin itself. My throat tightened once, then settled. Mara nodded to me and I stood, approached the clerk and set the coin on the evidence pad. The metal gave a soft, definitive click against wood. Judge Vance examined the engraving through reading glasses, then looked to the clerk. "Mark this as provisional exhibit, pending digital authentication." She shifted her gaze to me. "Ms. Anderson, are you prepared to testify narrowly to ownership, deployment status, and discovery timeline?" "Yes, Your Honor." I took the stand and answered exactly as instructed. Dates, storage status, notification defects, first confirmed notice of sale, content categories, legal significance. Mr. Danning tried twice to draw me into family history, asking about sibling disagreements and personal resentment. I answered with record boundaries. My emotions are not the claim. The claim is unlawful transfer and fraudulent documentation. On his third attempt, Judge Vance intervened. "Counsel, the court has heard enough on family dynamics. Return to statutory elements." He pivoted to auction finality. Mara objected, then requested judicial notice of transfer limitations where source disposal was defective. Judge Vance reviewed the cited statute for less than a minute, then spoke in the calm voice of someone closing a door she had already measured. "On this emergency posture, petitioner has met threshold for probable unlawful transfer and irreparable records risk. The court orders the following: immediate injunction against further disposition by respondents and agents, expedited seizure and hold of recoverable inventoried property identified in Exhibits D and F, preservation and release under protective order of corridor footage referenced in today's filing, temporary suspension of unilateral stewardship actions over contested family assets pending evidentiary hearing. Additionally, Respondent Caleb Anderson is prohibited from representing sole custodial authority in dealings tied to the disputed inventory." She paused, eyes on Caleb now rather than counsel. "Mr. Anderson, this is not a suggestion. Violation will be treated as contempt." The reversal lasted under 2 minutes. That was all it required. He had spent years building status through rooms and toasts and curated introductions, and the court removed operational control with 6 numbered directives and a signature line. The clerk began reading the order terms back for clarity. Mara wrote one word on my legal pad and angled it toward me. "Breathe." I did once, and felt the tremor I had held in reserve move out through my hands and disappear into the wood rail. Mr. Danning requested a stay, citing reputational harm and business disruption. Judge Vance shook her head before he finished. "Reputational inconvenience does not outweigh evidentiary risk where forgery is credibly alleged and records are controlled." She scheduled a full hearing window and set strict deadlines for production, including banking and disposal records. "Non-compliance will invite sanctions. We are done for today." The gavel did not slam, she simply rose, and the bailiff called adjournment. Yet the effect was more final than any theatrical strike. People stood slowly, as if recalibrating gravity. Caleb remained seated 1 beat too long. When he finally stood, he reached for his water glass, missed the stem, and corrected with a movement so abrupt the ice knocked against crystal. He swallowed hard once, then again, the second swallow dry enough that I could see his throat work from across the aisle. Colour drained from his face in visible stages, first around the mouth, then under the eyes, until the confident donor hall composure gave way to something unpracticed and flat. He leaned toward Mr. Danning and spoke from the side of his mouth, forgetting for the first time that microphones lingered near counsel tables. "Fix this now." Danning did not answer immediately. He was reading the order again, lips parted, thumb holding place at the injunction paragraph. "We will evaluate appellate options," he said at last, voice formal and carefully detached. "For now, you will comply. I have a board meeting at 1400. Then you will disclose the order at 1400. Caleb turned to the 2 Foundation associates behind him, searching for the reflexive nod he usually received. The retired brigadier looked down at his own hands and adjusted his cuff with unnecessary concentration. The other associate stepped back half a pace, then another, as if physical distance could predate legal distance. No one offered him language. No one offered him a strategy in public. Dependence on audience perception had always been his strongest instrument. Now the audience was watching the instrument fail. A court officer approached with a service packet and requested acknowledgement signature for immediate enforcement notices. Caleb took the pen, stared at the signature line, and began, I am not the proper, the officer interrupted, polite and immovable. You are named respondent under direct order, sir. He signed. The signature looked compressed, letters crowded, unlike the broad, confident loops he used on donor correspondence. By the rail, trustee Harlan Pike stood with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in the low, urgent cadence of financial damage control. I heard fragments as he turned. Yes. Discretionary authority suspended. No, effective immediately. Freeze any transfer requests linked to his signatory alone until council review. He caught me watching and looked away so quickly it might have been reflex. 30 feet from the bench, institutional language was already stripping him in real time, exactly the way praise had once dressed him. My mother had entered quietly during testimony and now stood near the back pew, one hand gripping her handbag strap so tightly the knuckles blanched. She opened her mouth as I approached, then closed it when she saw Trent beside me and Mara gathering sealed exhibits with methodical care. Whatever plea she had prepared depended on private ambiguity. The order had removed it. She settled for a whisper. Avery, I answered without hostility and without rescue. Read the order. She nodded once, not agreement, only recognition that there was nothing left to negotiate in tone. Near the exit, a court technology clerk confirmed receipt of Judge Vance's directive for corridor footage release and asked both counsel to designate secure transfer endpoints within the hour. Mara gave ours immediately. Danning asked for time. The clerk replied, "The order says immediate initiation." External contact outcome, finally converted from stall to compliance. Trent closed his document case, checked each seal and handed me a certified copy of the registry attestation for my records. "Keep this separate from your main binder," he said quietly. "If anyone asks for originals outside formal process, decline." "I will." He gave a brief nod, then turned toward the clerk's desk to complete witness release paperwork. Loaded setup paid off, cleanly and in public. Caleb made one last attempt before leaving the well. He stepped into my path. Not close enough to touch, close enough to reclaim an audience if I reacted. "You think this makes you a hero," he said, voice low and strained. "It makes you disloyal." I held his gaze and kept my tone level enough that only he and Mara heard. "It makes me documented." For a moment he looked as if he might continue, might reach for one more polished insult, one more line built to draw laughter and restore his center. Nothing came. His lips pressed into a thin, colourless line and he moved aside. The man who had filled brass halls with certainty left a county courtroom in procedural silence, carrying an order that named his limits in numbered paragraphs. When we stepped into the corridor, the fluorescent hum sounded almost gentle after the compression of the hearing. Mara handed me the certified interim order, still warm from the copier. "This is the first lock," she said. "We keep turning." I slid the order into the front of my binder behind the tab marked Remedy and felt, for the first time since the gala, not triumph, but alignment. In the same civic air where he had tried to classify me as anecdotal, the record had classified him as restrained. His colour had gone. His voice had failed. His allies had recalculated in public view. He was still my brother by blood, but blood no longer controlled the file. I slid the binder closed on the courthouse corridor rail, and Mara steered us toward the technology clerk's station before anyone could reclaim momentum through conversation. The station sat behind a half door with chipped paint, and a sign that read "Digital Evidence Intake," and it smelled like warm plastic and stale coffee. Danning arrived 30 seconds later, still carrying Caleb's confidence like a coat he no longer wanted to wear, and gave the clerk a transfer address with 2 corrections and 1 apology. The clerk did not respond to either. She verified the order number, typed with brisk precision, and said, "Release packet initiated to both designated endpoints. Chain log will auto-send. If either side fails checksum on receipt, notify this desk today, not tomorrow." The upload took 7 minutes. We watched the progress bar move in silence while the fluorescent light flattened everyone into the same exhausted palette. At 99%, Danning asked for a private copy first for internal review sequencing. The clerk pointed to Judge Vance's signature line and said, "Simultaneous release is the sequence." When the transfer completed, my phone vibrated with the chain log. Source camera corridor 2241 to 2258. Integrity hash verified. Export sealed. External contact resolved. The administrator who had told me board consent was required emailed 2 minutes later with a formal retraction and a retention confirmation extended to litigation hold status. I forwarded both to Mara and tagged them into Exhibit Supplemental 3. We reviewed the footage in a conference cubicle off the clerk's corridor. The camera angle was high and indifferent, which made it better than any memory. At 22:43, the staff captain checked badges at the suite threshold exactly as I remembered. At 22:44, Caleb stepped into frame and pointed first to the sidewall seating zone, then to a printed list in his hand. At 22:46, he spoke to the coordinator and tapped the microphone stand near the wall, then shook his head. No audio, no theatrics, only instruction. At 22:51, I entered frame and was routed to the back row. At 22:54, he looked toward me and smiled for the room. The clip ended at 22:58 with him escorting trustees to the private elevator while I remained near the side table. Distinctive detail resolved. Exclusion had been staged in logistics, not personality. I exported stills with timestamps and inserted them behind the agenda copy and the incident slip from the lobby guard. The unknown tipster remained unknown. The number returned an automated deadline by afternoon, and no one ever claimed credit. I recorded that too. At 13:42, we crossed to the Foundation Tower because Judge Vance's order required immediate disclosure to anybody exercising contested authority. The board meeting room on the top floor was all glass walls, matte black hardware, and the low hum of central air set too cold for comfort. Caleb stood at the head of the table with his laptop open to a slide titled Continuity Communications, as though the hearing had been a scheduling inconvenience. Trustee Pike sat 2 chairs down, phone face up, jaw tight. The retired brigadier was present as a guest advisor, eyes fixed on a legal pad he did not write on. My mother sat near the far end with both hands folded over a closed notebook, posture formal enough to hide tremor. Danning entered behind us and placed the signed order in front of the board chair. Ellen Ward, who read the first page once, then again, then asked for the appendix. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Mr. Anderson," she said to Caleb, "did you represent yourself this morning as unrestricted sole steward while this order was pending?" "It was a preliminary conference," he said. "No final merits finding." "That was not my question." He swallowed and tried a different angle. "The family dispute has been weaponized. I was protecting assets." Ward slid the page toward him and tapped the injunction paragraph with one finger. "From this moment, you are not authorized to move, dispose, pledge, or represent disputed assets under Foundation umbrella, directly or through proxies." She looked to counsel. "Confirm." Danning gave a short nod. "That is the plain effect." Pike spoke then, voice brittle. "Can we contain this internally?" Ward turned to him. "It is already in court. Internal containment is no longer a category." She pressed the intercom and asked compliance to join by speaker. A woman from the Foundation's banking partner came online within a minute, identified herself and read account actions in measured sequence. Discretionary signatory privileges tied solely to Caleb were frozen pending dual control review. Outbound transfers above routine payroll required chair and council clearance. Legacy disbursement channels linked to contested trust instruments were suspended pending court direction. The language was procedural and devastating. Caleb tried to interrupt at "frozen." Ward held up her hand without looking at him, and the compliance officer continued to the end. Then Ward opened a second folder. Inside was my copied agenda from the gala night, the one that listed my records as unavailable, now paired with corridor stills and the exclusion slip. "We will vote on interim removal under Fiduciary Breach Clause 8.4, she said. "Conflict of interest, material misrepresentation, and obstruction of named party access during active dispute." The vote was not dramatic. It was 8-1. The one dissent came from Pike, and he did not make eye contact with anyone while casting it. Caleb's seat was vacated effective immediately. Security credentials were deactivated before we left the room. My mother remained seated after the vote, as if standing would concede too much too quickly. When the others filed out, she looked at me with the same unfinished sentence she had carried since the courthouse pew. "I read the order," she said quietly. "I read your declaration as well." I waited. "He told me you were unreachable," she continued. "He said notices came back and fees kept accruing. I wanted the story to be tidy, so I accepted tidy." Her fingers tightened on the notebook edge. I was wrong. It was not absolution. It was not enough to repair years. It was, finally, accurate. What you did with that wrong was yours, I said. What you do now is yours too. She nodded, eyes wet but steady. I will sign the corrective affidavit Mara sent today. Loaded setup resolved. She signed that afternoon in a notary room on the same floor, and the affidavit entered the docket before close of business. 3 days later, under marshal supervision, we met at the auction warehouse on the industrial edge of the county, where metal roll-up doors rattled in crosswind and the concrete smelled of oil and dust. The warehouse manager produced transfer sheets, bidder lists, and salvage tags that had looked clean until matched against my ledger. Some lots had already been resold beyond practical recovery. Those moved into damages valuation. 4 lots were traceable and recoverable on site. We opened each in sequence with body camera recording active, inventory clerk present, and chain forms pre-printed. Physical evidence resolved line by line, patent originals recovered in Box 4C, with tamper tape broken but pages complete, 2 trust instrument folders recovered from Lot 11 with water staining on outer sleeves but signatures intact. 1 archival drive case recovered from Lot 19, seals cut, drive serials matching manifest. Missing items were listed as unrecoverable and assigned compensation schedules under court order. The tamper strips I had preserved from my home case were admitted to show my own key had remained sealed until post-incident authentication. The invitation, napkin agenda, handwritten notes, staff captain card, Pike voicemail transcript, anonymous tip screenshot, and corridor footage log were all marked either admitted or stipulated authentic by the final hearing conference. At final merits, Caleb sat beside Danning with the posture of a man trying not to be seen while sitting in the centre row. Judge Vance issued findings from the bench in controlled cadence. Abandonment notice defective and fraud tainted, transfer chain void where recoverable, compensatory damages awarded for converted property not recoverable, punitive component reserved to statutory cap review, forgery count referred to the district prosecutor. She confirmed that the recovered trust instruments controlled succession language and that interim inheritance control transferred to me as designated accountable beneficiary, pending administrative completion. No one applauded. Courtrooms do not. But the silence that followed belonged to fact, not fear. After adjournment, Pike approached with the strained civility of someone negotiating with his own memory. "That voicemail I left," he said, eyes on the floor tile. "I should not have framed it that way." "You framed it exactly the way the room was operating," I answered. "The record needed that." He accepted that with a small, defeated nod and walked away. The retired brigadier never offered an explanation for his silence at the gala or the briefing. In my notes, I marked him as witness to hierarchy, no statement given. The staff captain from the suite checkpoint provided a short declaration through counsel confirming he had acted on Caleb's direct instructions. The coordinator did the same. Their documents went in cleanly without ornament. That evening, I returned home with 2 banker's boxes of certified copies and the challenge coin in its case. I set the court order on my kitchen island under warm light, then placed each resolved thread where it belonged. Originals in the fire safe, certified copies in the litigation cabinet, digital evidence mirrored to encrypted storage, personal notes scanned and archived, duplicate binders delivered to counsel. Nothing remained loose on purpose. Nothing remained loose by accident. At 21:17, I stood by the window where rain had started again, lighter this time, and listened to the house settle around me. Caleb had called me a nobody in a brass hall because he believed audience could outrank evidence. He sold what he did not understand because he believed custody was whatever he could narrate first. The court did not care about his narrative. The board did not survive on his confidence. The records held. My name held. Silence was never peace. It was surrender, and I no longer surrendered my name to anyone, least of all the man who sold what he never bothered to understand.